Minister is getting rock star treatment on his inaugural visit to Israel. The Prime Minister being singled out for his unwavering support of the Middle East's only true democracy. And a very good Monday morning to you. Great to have you here with us. Stephen Harper is getting the red carpet treatment as he is being lauded for his great friendship with Israel. Of course, this is his first visit to the region, and it is a significant one. He's being praised by his very good friend, President Benjamin Netanyahu, for fighting anti-Semitism, for championing the people of Israel, and taking a very tough stance on Iran. Steve McDonald is with us from the Central for Israel and Jewish Affairs. Good to have you here with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about the significance of this visit, because this is not just any visit to the Middle Eastern region for this Prime Minister.
No, it's his inaugural visit to the Middle East and to Israel. It's a very large delegation of Canadians, including rabbis, including
21 rabbis. That's
21
a lot.
rabbis. It's a big delegation.
Why such a big delegation?
Well, I think the government recognizes that in the case of rabbis really are in many ways representatives of their communities. They are stakeholders. They are in many cases they transcend politics, and they do really reflect the diversity of the Canadian Jewish community. And I think it's only natural when a visit to the Jewish state of this nature is taking place.
I think a lot of people have been critical of the size of this delegation. He will not be making this kind of trip again, so I understand the size of it. It's not unnatural for a Prime Minister to take a lot of people, but a lot of critics are saying too many people, too expensive for taxpayers to pay. Why do you defend such a large number? What are we getting out of this?
Well, I think Canada can benefit increasingly from Israel in a range of areas. Obviously, Canada is very interested to hear what Israel has to say when it comes to the Middle East post-Arab Spring and the security threats emanating from that region. But there is much more that can be done to expand the Canada-Israel relationship in the areas of trade, high-tech cooperation, energy cooperation. You know, Canada is an energy giant, and Israel just recently discovered a very large deposit of natural gas off its Mediterranean coast, just as an example of the sort of niche area in which Canada and Israel are well suited. But in terms
which would explain why Joe Oliver might be going.
Right. But in terms of the size of the delegation, my understanding is that although there were a number of people, a small proportion of the delegation did fly on the Prime Minister's jet, the rest of the delegation, the vast majority, covered their own flight costs and flew independently and met up with the mission in Israel. And as you know, the media paid their own ticket, and
yes,
so
they did.
I think the story is a bit blown out of proportion.
This is a very deeply personal. I don't think it's widely known what Harper's, I guess, feelings are about Israel. But his father, it was deeply personal to his father. It's not a story that is widely reported, but there's a bigger reason why Mr. Harper might have such affection for Israel.
For sure, and you're right. Prime Minister Harper doesn't discuss it publicly very often, but it's clear that his father, who came of age during the Second World War, was deeply affected by the events of that war. He was too young to enlist, but he did have a number of friends who were Holocaust survivors in Toronto. He was deeply affected by the depth of Nazi depravity in Europe. And I think his father recognized that anti-Semitism is a particularly pervasive form of hatred. And when left unchecked, it can not only be turned against the Jewish people, but it can be turned against society at large. And that's exactly what happened in the case of the Nazis.
Yeah, and his father had said to him, you know, before he passed away, if you ever get into a position of power, it is your duty. You must do something for these people.
Right, and I think that speaks to the gravity of kind of his consciousness when it came to again, the Nazi depravity in Europe and what happened to the Jewish people. And also, I think he probably recognized that Israel, as the only liberal democracy in the region, as a safe haven for the Jewish people. In the future, should any similar situation unfold in any part of the world, the Jewish people would never again have to face a situation in which they would not be able to escape because Israel exists as a safe haven. And so I think that explains, to a large extent, Joseph Harper's perspective on this.
He has referred to, the Prime Minister has referred to Israel as the light of freedom and democracy in what is otherwise a region of darkness. Right. He has not wavered at all in his position on Israel, but he has been criticized for it.
Right, and I mean, look, I think in politics, whenever the Prime Minister takes a position, there are going to be critics, that's inevitable, but I don't think Canada's strong support for Israel in any way is incompatible with Canada's strong standing in the Arab world. In fact, a Palestinian Authority advisor in 2012 told the Globe and Mail, because Canada is such a close friend of Israel, we're eligible to play an even greater role in advancing peace in the region and peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So I don't think the fact that Canada is such a strong proponent of Israel's security needs, that in any way is incompatible with supporting Palestinian statehood, supporting practical, responsible investments in the Palestinian Authority. And we did see that today.
And he has announced funding, $66 million, which is a dramatic drop for the region. And I'm talking about his funding and aid for the Palestinian region. They will say his view on Israel is very unbalanced. They'll still take the money, but
right.
His view of Israel is unbalanced.
And I think the Palestinian Authority does recognize, and I mean, rhetoric is one thing, but the Palestinian Authority does recognize that it needs to have in place the conditions on the ground that will make a peace deal, if one is signed, hopefully, that will make a peace deal successful. There is increasingly a gap between the consciousness of the Israeli public and the Palestinian public. If you look at polls, the vast majority of Israelis are ready for peace and ready for a two-state solution. If you look at polls on the other side, a very sizable proportion of the Palestinian public, about one half, support Hamas and support terror tactics and terror groups. This gap needs to be closed if any peace deal is going to hold. And the way you close it is by investing in initiatives on the ground in the Palestinian territories that are practical, that build up Palestinian policing and the court system, that educate the next generation of Palestinians for peace rather than for hatred, and that provide economic opportunity for Palestinians. And so, on the one hand, the bilateral negotiation track is important, and the Americans are front and center in that, but countries like Canada can play a very practical role in helping to foster peace on the ground. He
is making a historical speech today in the Israeli parliament. No sitting Canadian Prime Minister has done this. So it's a very significant day as we wait to hear what Mr. Harper has to say. And I would think that there'll be some comments that come out that will be quite significant. Should he be an honest broker in this region? Can he take a role in what is going on between the United States and Palestine? I
think, again, what's really needed is less pressure, I think, on the bilateral track. I think the Americans, like I said, are quite capable in negotiating or arbitrating that track. What's really needed are countries to step up in the form of responsible resources rather than simply rhetoric. And so I think Canada has already done quite a bit. In fact, many Canadians wouldn't be aware that a small contingent of Canadian troops have been at the forefront for a number of years of training Palestinian security forces. This is very practical, important work, because what it's done is it's allowed Israeli troops to actually be removed from major Palestinian population centers, and their presence has been replaced by Palestinian security forces. It's good for Israel. It's good for Israel's security. It's good for Palestinian moderates and for Palestinian self-governance. And at the end of the day, it's the sort of work that will enable a peace deal to actually hold.
Yeah, and a lot of people will be watching that speech. Of course, we'll bring that speech to you live. We hope to, anyway, when it takes place around 11:30. Let's bring in Marissa Simcue to this conversation, because this trip, while a foreign policy issue, it is a big deal for Canada, getting a lot of chatter going.
Absolutely. There are quite a few people online basically making comments about how Prime Minister Stephen Harper is being received with rock star treatment, they call it. And if you look at the front page of the Jerusalem Post, just behind me, we've got their headline says, Netanyahu receives Harper with honor guard blaring trumpets. Now, there are some people that are cynical of this trip, saying he's merely playing politics, trying to gain Jewish votes in Canada. But quite frankly, Alex, you know, Prime Minister Harper has sided with Israel on a number of occasions. He's consistently sided with Israel at the UN General Assembly in September, and of course at the G8. He's been very vocal in his support, and so questions, of course, you know, is it so hard to believe that Prime Minister Harper would take such a hard stance in support of Israel? And certainly this trip is showing that he's doing just that. But again, some people showing some cynicism with respect to this trip, calling it rock star treatment, undeserved rock star treatment, and others saying, well, no, wait a minute, he deserves that treatment, certainly. And that's exactly what how he has been received since arriving in Israel.
Yeah, and Steve, interesting, I mean, vote grabber. I think if you're turning to any population for vote grabbing, it would not be the Jewish community. There are not worldwide that many Jews. There's 18 million Jews. So if Mr. Harper really wanted to grab the vote, he might turn to a different community.
Yeah, in Canada, about 1% of the population is Jewish. It's somewhere between 350 and 380,000 Canadians. It does tend to be an active population in terms of...
And they generally vote Liberal.
In past, they have generally voted Liberal. In the last election, about half of them voted Conservative. But it does tend to be a community that's very active in philanthropy, that's very active in, certainly in, I think, contributing to the broader Canadian community. And so it is a community that probably has a higher profile than its numbers would allow normally. But you're quite right. I mean, at the end of the day, if someone were looking to grab votes, I don't think that they would look immediately to the Jewish community.
But they should be taking notice, nonetheless. Steve, a pleasure. Thank you, always.
Thanks.
He's Steve McDonald with CIJA, that is the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. After the break, the politics of this trip.